Welcome to What Is It About the Weather, where once a week we get together and explore how weather intertwines itself. Sometimes, obviously, sometimes a little bit more subtly into our everyday lives. I'm your host, Mark Jelanic, and this week we're going to get back to one of those favorite topics we do from time to time about did weather change history? Or in this case, put a little spin on that. We're going to do did history change weather? But before we jump into the main topic, what's today? September 8th, I think. If if you're listening to this today and you haven't gotten out of the path of Irma and you're in Florida, please do. You know, you can listen to this on the way, but be on the road. That's all I got to say about this one. It's just, anybody who's been watching the news knows that Hurricane Irma has been making all the stirs, from things as weird as Richard Branson leaving his little privately owned island, hunkering down in his wine cellar, to just the complete devastation it's brought on some of these smaller islands where people don't necessarily have a means to quickly evacuate, and the catastrophic level of direct weather impacts has been pretty significant. And of course, right on the heels of that, we have Jose. We're still recovering from what's going on with Harvey. This is not to mention even this morning, as I read through this, major earthquake off the coast of southeast Mexico. We've already mentioned the floods in the last episode that have been going on in Southeast Asia. Just a lot of big profile events right now. And it's just a reminder, I think, to all of us, hopefully, that we take a moment and, I don't know, whoever it is that matters to you, let them know you care. And if they're in harm's way, make sure you're doing what you can to offer to help. And if you have a chance beyond that to provide assistance to those that are directly impacted by these big events. And like I said, I try not to get just U.S.-centric because we have so many listeners that listen around the globe. When these major events hit, they are an opportunity for humanity to be at its best. And I love reading the stories about that. And yes, there are always going to be cases of where it shows us our worst sides as well. But I think generally speaking, big disasters that are viewed as outside of our control, and that's always the thing with natural disasters. They're viewed as something that, no one asked for, no one put themselves in the situation where it was necessarily going to happen. It provides excellent opportunity, and I hope that you, all my listeners, will take an opportunity to show that side of yourself, whatever your situation may be, in whatever way you can. Now, along those lines, as you know, Weather Ready Nation Ambassador, that's been doing that for a few months, and they're, again, North American fall season sort of update here, where they talk about, these are some of the typical hazards and ways to deal with it. But one of them was about hurricanes. And again, no matter where you are on the globe, if you're exposed to the potential risk of tropical cyclones, whatever you call them, typhoons, hurricanes, just straight up tropical cyclones, whatever it might be, this page has useful information, and they made a point of highlighting that area. So take a look at it. I'll make sure that one's in the show notes for you. Now, my other public service announcement. Are you kidding me? This has nothing to do with weather, but if you live in the U.S., straight up, Equifax, who's one of the big credit reporting firms, was hacked over the course of the summer. You need to, and I'm going to put a link in the show notes on this one. Very odd, a little different, but follow that link and go find out if you've been exposed. Let me put it this way. If you're an adult and you have credit, there's a good chance that some of your information has been potentially exposed. The challenge so often with some of these things is we just don't know how bad it is, but I don't care. This is kind of, I don't think it could get any worse. These are the people that have critical information in one place. And that to me is huge for anybody, no matter where you are. And take some time, figure out, they're going to offer free protection services or whatever else for whatever that's worth. But go and do the check and see if it's a concern for you. Again, link in the show notes. Wow. Lot just to digest just in the kickoff there. The other thing, I guess that always trying to look for a silver lining, right? This week here, for the first time, we got some much cooler temperatures in the morning, which was a nice, it's a reminder of change of seasons. And anybody who lives in parts of the world where you get that change of seasons, it can be very nice. For us in Atlanta, we always look for the break in the morning dew points, right? How much, not only how cool does it get, but when does some of that drier air work in? Because in the summertime, we tend to get in these muggy mornings, and you walk out the door and you're sweating. And it's not unique to where I'm sitting by any means, but a good portion of the country around me experiences that. And it's, certainly something that many people around the globe are familiar. Some people have to deal with it all year long. In Atlanta, it eventually breaks. And one of the other things, I've always thought, what do people look for those sort of seasonal breaks? And I was reminded of one. There was a show on, I think it was in the 90s, called Northern Exposure. And one of the things they talked about was the big kind of winter ice break. And this is actually a thing up in Alaska. So there's a kind of a well-known river there, the Tanana River. I'm probably saying that all wrong. And they even do kind of a contest, and they guess when the ice will break. But apparently sometimes it can be really loud, like a big cracking noise. I don't know that it drives any sort of earth response, but supposedly in the TV show you could feel it happening. But it also, they made a play on it leading into other wild behaviors. Whatever it is, I know we look forward to these things. And so that was a nice reminder of weather for me this week with all this stuff going on that, I'm having to keep an eye on and deal with, and that many people around the globe are dealing with. And particularly here in the Atlantic Basin right now with these sort of back-to-back. We've got another one coming just on the heels of Irma. So we went from Harvey to Irma, which is going to be, devastating and already has been for some. And now it's looking like this other one. While in some ways it may be out to sea, it looks initially like it's going to pass through some of these areas that were devastated by Irma. So stay strong out there, people. And, hopefully you'll push through this and move on to another day, and you'll get the support you need if you've been hit particularly hard, and moving on and recovering from this set of events. All right, lots of public service announcements this morning, and I don't want to, again, I don't want to dwell too much on that. I could talk to you all day. I could have sat here and gone on live, and we could have talked about hurricanes and tropical cyclones, but that's not what we do here, right? It's not the goal. It's not the premise of what we try to do. And I wanted to get back to a topic that, has become kind of a favorite with the audience, which is, did weather change history? And we've hit some big profile ones, like, recently we covered the kamikaze winds. In the past we've covered things like D-Day, a few other things, and has even been suggested by one of the people who brought this up, Jack, that maybe we look at some historic events and talk about them in the context, and that may become more of a regular segment. Not so much a whole episode sort of thing, but, just something that was major. And he suggested the big Galveston hurricane. And, I think I will work that in at some point. But wanted to kind of stick more to the general premise here, which is, was a weather event big enough to have what would be considered a meaningful shift in the history of humanity? On a large enough scale that it would have either had a global or at least a large regional influence in areas of power at the time that it happened to cause that. I mentioned some of the ones we've looked at, and there are others to look at in the future. But as I also brought up, one of the things that I wanted to do was to try to find something from areas maybe the English-speaking world, and it's tricky, and we'll talk about that, don't have as much connection with, in particular in South America, since I've spent some time living there. I wanted to look for said event, right? And there were a couple interesting things. One, when I was doing a Google search this time, and I don't know why this never came up before, but back in like 2008, the Weather Channel did a series. Looked like I don't know how many shows in total, let's say maybe 20, somewhere in that range. I don't think it was quite that many, where they examined, of course, some of the same things that we've talked about. So, maybe you can go find that on YouTube if you like doing video versions of some of these things or shorter versions of some of these things. And also found an interesting book that I hadn't run across before. I'm always intrigued by what little tweaks sometimes in a Google search will result in. But back to the South American conundrum, let's say. There are some notable events. There's some that movies have been made from, such as the Uruguayan flight that went down in the Andes, and it had a rugby team on it, and lots of people didn't make it, but some did. And yeah, you could argue it was an impactful event, but probably mostly just for a few people. Of course, there's always the talk about the Straits of Magellan and Drake's Passage around Cape Horn in South America, and the weather that goes on there and how many ships it's impacted, and how finding those things, the development of the Magellan Strait changed so many things, and how ships could get through. It was still a tricky passage, but was a lot safer than going the long way. And it also had a big influence on development of the region. But then the Panama Canal would come around and change all that. So, interesting, but I don't know. I couldn't find specific events that would really point me to say it would be newsworthy. One I really would hoped was going to have more of the weather element to it was a famous battle in Chilean history. It had to do with the whole stir in the region between Peru and Bolivia and Chile, and specifically in this case it was a Chile and Peru thing. And there was a little bit of weather involved. There was some fog involved one morning, not unusual for a sea situation, right? But to say that it was, I don't know, the turning point, it was tough to find that the weather was really the turning point in the event. It may have played a role, but I don't know that it was the quintessential piece that really drove it. Like, for instance, when we looked at the Spanish Armada issues, where clearly weather played a big role in the decimation of that fleet. So I came across a story. It was a little different, right? A little different. And like I said, it made the story more about, instead of weather changing history, it became more of, did history change weather? Now, you're thinking to yourself, I don't get it. I don't necessarily follow that. That's fine. We're going to walk through it. And hopefully you'll find it as interesting as I did. But let's start with the ship. It's called the HMS Beagle. And maybe you've heard of it. Maybe you haven't. And for those that think they might have, it will become obvious here in a bit. But it's a kind of a well-known ship. It was part of the British fleet. Had some interesting start facts. It was the first ship to sail under the New London Bridge at the time. And its first captain was a individual with the last name Pringle, Captain Pringle. Not a name that I think about very often, and quite often, here in the U.S. it's associated with a potato chip. I don't know that was the basis of it, but an interesting kind of start. Now, Captain Pringle would master the HMS Beagle in support of a grand kind of survey mission that was going on. And much of this had to do with the area around South America. And he kind of got maybe the short end of the stick a little bit. He ended up down in that area we were talking about, Drake's Passage, Magellan Strait. And at that point in time, it was essentially the end of the world. Not a lot going on, not great weather for when he was there. He didn't seem to be the happiest guy in the world. So he got to the end of the world, as it was known, And then he turned around and he shot himself, locked himself in his cabin and shot himself. Now, the weird twist on this is, it's always reported that he committed suicide or killed himself, but it wasn't a quick thing. He would shoot himself and then live for another 10 days. It was thought he might recover before he ended up dying. So just one of those, events that kind of throws you off, I'm sure as a crew member, watching this go down. But not just a straight up simple end of life thing. So these guys go back to, let's just, there's some story in between there, but they eventually get back to England. And the ship would go through a refitting. The refitting had to do with the way the whole ship laid out. They changed the decking, which apparently helped it so it wasn't as top heavy. It wouldn't be as prone to potentially being sunk by too much water on the deck, or being changed the way in which it could respond at a minimum. But it was refitted with 22 chronometers. Okay, so it was going to help. That was kind of, in that day and age, that was the better way at sea to deal with understanding what longitude you were. And anybody who's never looked into that, that's a huge story, and it's been written about both in nonfiction and fictional settings. But dealing with latitude was the easy part, but longitude and understanding where you were east and west was the tricky part. And this was one of the big things that was developed, and they finally figured out how to make these things freestanding, and so it could deal with the sways of ocean and everything. Why they needed 22, I'm still not exactly sure, but so it was like having a little mini GPS on the ship, right? So maybe you cross-checked all the different instruments to determine the precise location. And the new captain even wanted to change the cannons where they weren't iron but brass, so that wouldn't interfere with the instrumentation as much. Kind of an interesting note. He, of course, was rejected on that request. It would also even get some new weather equipment, a symphysometer, or multiples of those as well. Now, this was kind of a change-up. It was a combo thermometer-barometer, but it changed the barometer part into a new style. Again, supposed to work a little better in the marine environment. But let's be real, folks. What the second voyage was really known for was its participation of a crew member that would become well known as Charles Darwin, right? And I don't know where you as an individual sit on the debate of his findings and how you feel about his research, but certainly very well known, and a pivotal point in history in what he would propose later, not during the voyage, but after the voyage, in all his writings. But the basis was found primarily in his time in this voyage. But what's interesting, and where we get into the weather twist, so clearly a very historical, okay, so here's the reality, right? That is without a doubt, like I said, no matter where you sit in this debate, all right, whether you subscribe to completely the evolution theory, completely creation, or somewhere in between, really doesn't matter where you sit. That was probably the most pronounced change in the topic and how we discuss the topic and talk about the topic would be from what Charles Darwin would write for a period of time. And this voyage was kind of the, based on history, is the quintessential kind of moment that those ideas would start formulating and really codify in his brain such that he was able to articulate it later. But how did Charles Darwin get on the ship? Why was he even there? Right? So we already have a pretty major historic event that could not have happened. Now, given that this wasn't a weather ship, that's where I'm saying weather didn't create that. But here we had a major history event that may not have taken place. But let's talk about the weather connection on it. So again, how did Darwin get on it? Well, it has to do with the new captain, a gentleman by the name of Robert Fitzroy. Now, Robert Fitzroy, when he was, deciding on what the makeup of his crew was going to be on this second voyage of the HMS Beagle, sought out someone of Charles Darwin's profile, somebody who was a naturalist, but a thinking man sort of thing, and that would be his, companion at the dinner table kind of thing. And through a sequence of events, Charles Darwin ended up being that person. Now, at this point, you're probably going, but okay, Mark, what does all this have to do with weather? Well, this is where that all starts to come into play. So let's talk a little bit about old Robert Fitzroy. Now, apparently he was a very able and meticulous captain and could be a bit moody. His nickname was apparently Hot Coffee. I can imagine where that sort of nickname might come from. But in his time and in his lifespan, particularly post this journey, all right, where he and Darwin got into some spats, but at that time their mindsets were very similar. You would say that Darwin is probably more liberal. Fitzroy would become more conservative later in life, and they would actually become opposite ends of the spectrum, but they were probably more similar in that age than dissimilar. But Fitzroy would get a gold medal from the Royal Geographical Survey, for his work that he had done with this particular effort. And even after the return from this voyage, he was recognized as a reasonable leader and was sent off to be the second governor of New Zealand. Now, that didn't really actually work out very well. And, of course, there's some debates whether he had the resources to do the job and the person who came in after him was given all the support he wasn't given. I can't speak to all that. That's the way, history reads sometimes. But let's just say that didn't go well. So he ended up back in England. And this is where we really get into the weather twist. Now, you can imagine the way he outfitted that ship, that clearly there was an interest in weather. But when he came back to the UK after, things not going well, and he did some was charge of a dockyard, some other things, was put into a position called the meteorological statist, we might call this a statistician today, in any case, to the Board of Trade. He was in charge of compiling all the information we knew about weather and determining if anything useful could be done with it. Now, that role would ultimately, this office would turn into what would become the UK Met Office, which would be kind of the second, I think it was the second, somewhere I remember Austria being first. By the way, we finally did get a listener in Austria. I don't know if I mentioned that. Interesting side note. But in any case, so in this role, this little office, him and 3 people would eventually be driving this thing that would become what is known around the world today as the UK Met Office. So he was there in the beginning. He was also credited with kind of coining the phrase weather forecast. And not because of just any reason. His weather forecast, his weather ramblings, whatever, started appearing in the Times in 1860, although officially in 1861 he started issuing true weather forecast. Now, at the same time, he was probably the first meteorologist to deal with the meteorologists are only right 50% of the time kind of problem. Because sometimes he was right, sometimes he wasn't. But as you can imagine, in that day and age, trying to compile all this information, and they did have the benefit of the telegraph. And we've talked about that before, about how important trying to do any sort of forecasting was with having upstream information, if you will. But he was very impacted by some tragedies at sea that happened around this time that really compelled him to want to do this forecasting. So with a staff of 3 people, was doing something that today that same group of that office has, I believe, around 1,500 employees. Now, they do a much grander level of effort, okay? But the weather forecast, quintessentially, the HMS Beagle and that little sequence of events delivered us the person who would be responsible for creating the weather forecast. Now, you could argue it would have happened eventually or whatever else, and I'm sure it would have. But as with all things, you look for those moments that are tipping points in history. And we are where we are today with the science, probably because of how long we've been focused on this issue. And what if it had been waited 20 years or 30 years? It's just like anything else. Had people said, it's just not worthy of spending your time on it, that sort of thing. And he had to fight those battles. I mean, sending telegraphs were very expensive then. And there was a belief that he was wasting time gathering all this information. But he laid the groundwork for very important advances in the field of meteorology. So, did weather change history? No. In this case, did history change weather? Well, yeah, I think it did. I don't know that it changed it for, it would have never happened, but it certainly was key in the timing of it all. He had a very powerful moment. As an example today, somebody living through one of these hurricanes, we're going to see this. We always tend to see these things. There are going to be people who have dealt with extreme tragedy on some of these Caribbean islands, as an example, who are going to be compelled and desired to become future meteorologists. And that passion that they've developed because they survived this event and lived through this event will probably drive them in not becoming just ordinary, but they'll want to work that much harder because they'll have a purpose behind what they're doing that might be stronger than some others. So I think this is an example of that. He was compelled by some of the things he saw behind him that made him more than ever want to work on this weather forecasting and show that it was something viable. So, history changed weather, if you will. All right. I hope you enjoyed that little one. Like I said, I still, I need to dive into some more. I don't know. I guess I need to look to the listener base and say, any of you who have some non-English things who can get them into English for me and help with that, if you have some historic events that you think would be good that aren't being shared, or that I might miss because my searches are going to generally be in English. And even here in South America, and while I do speak some Spanish, it's hard for me to dig deeply and to know maybe some of those events that have just never been written about in English. And there are plenty of them. If you have some of that, let me know. I'm always, I like looking at this from a global perspective. And we see, we've covered different parts of the globe, but I think it would be interesting to be able to cover, parts that we might not normally look at and expose everybody to all this. All right, well, with all this talk about hurricanes, I did get a question this week about what are spaghetti models and why are they called that? So quite often with tropical cyclones, you will see time to time some graphics with what looks like just a bunch of strings out there. And this is not the only case in meteorology where we use what's called spaghetti models, but you can imagine it just looking like a plate of spaghetti. And actually, the more it looks like spaghetti, the that's usually not a good thing. And really all that is, and we've talked about this before, is a representation of a specific event within probabilities. We've talked about sometimes on how weather map it's harder to do because how do you show all the different probabilities in a broader perspective? But the benefit you have with tracks is you're not thinking in as many dimensions. You have a single point that you're moving throughout time. And where that point ends up is a little easier to visualize than some other weather phenomena when you're trying to explore probabilities. And all those tracks are, and this is, I shouldn't say all, it's a representation of what the future of that tropical cyclone, or again, hurricane, whatever you might call it, typhoon, looks like. Some of them can be from one model, like we've talked about ensemble models, and it's just different representations that we're seeing. And some of them where you'll see are multi-model blends and all that. But don't get too hung up on where all the data is coming from. Just know that what it's trying to represent or display for you is how much we understand what's going to happen to the future of that event. So the more spread out those outcomes are, the less certainty we have, and or the more they're telling us that there's a lot of things that have to happen from point A to point B that could have a bigger impact on where this thing goes and what it looks like than when it's nice and tightly put together. So the more tightly bunched together things are, and you usually see this the shorter the time frame, they usually are more bunched together. It's not always the case. But the shorter the time frame, usually the better we understand what's going to happen, and or the chances of some part of the equation having a big impact are less likely. It's usually, I'm just summarizing here, but that's what spaghetti models are. It's just really a representation of a point in its future, as opposed to trying to look at a big area in its future. All right. I want to shout out to Aaron. Aaron, thanks for going over the Facebook page and asking me about my Pete's Church. If you want to read about it, you can go to the Facebook page and take a look at it. But I appreciate you trying to engage on Facebook. Not everybody, I haven't made that a big push. But I appreciate you making that effort. So, with all that, let's wrap up. You know the drill. You can reach out a couple different ways. whatisitabouttheweather@gmail.com or whatisitabouttheweather.com/contact. And for all of you supporting the podcast, it's greatly appreciated. You know the drill. RSVP, rate, share, validate, and pledge. You can learn more about that approach over at whatisitabouttheweather.com/support. So until next time, as we all know, and keep in mind, because that's what makes all this fun and enjoyable to talk about, there's much more to weather than the weather itself.
There's your 2 White Sofa production.
We're tired of hearing our uncle grovel, so please support him on patreon.com/weather.